Chapter 1: The City of Echoes. Pompeii. The morning of October 24th, 79 AD. Part 1: The Waking of the Beast. The day began as deceptively ordinary. The sun rose over the Servian wall at 6:30 a.m., burning off the morning mist that clung to the Sarno River. Pompeii was not a massive metropolis like Rome. It was a prosperous provincial resort town, a place of 12,000 souls where wealthy Romans came to escape the heat of the capital and spend their money. As the light hit the streets, the city woke with a roar. Pompeii was a loud, aggressive, colorful assault on the senses. It was not the beige stone ruin we see today. It was a riot of color. The buildings were painted in garish reds, ochres, and blues. Political graffiti covered every available wall, screaming for the election of local magistrates in bright red letters. The fruit sellers ask you to elect Marcus Halconius Priscus. The petty thieves support Vatia. In the House of the Faun, one of the largest and most opulent villas in the city, the slaves were already awake. They were scrubbing the mosaic floors, masterpieces depicting Alexander the Great, with wet rags. The master of the house was likely still asleep, hungover from a banquet the night before. The air in the atrium smelled of the previous night's oil lamps and stale wine. In the kitchen, a cook was preparing breakfast, unaware that the charcoal brazier he was lighting was a miniature version of the fire that would soon consume them all. The domestic rhythm was comforting and absolute, the baking of bread, the washing of tunics, the scolding of children. It was the sound of a city that assumed it had a future. Part 2: The Smell of Money. Down on the Via dell'Abbondanza, the street of abundance, the commercial heart of the city was pumping. The street was paved with massive polygonal stones, worn smooth by the iron wheels of carts. Stepping stones allowed pedestrians to cross the road without stepping in the sewage and muck that flowed in the gutters. The air here did not smell of roses, it smelled of garum. Pompeii was famous for this fermented fish sauce, a pungent, salty condiment that was the ketchup of the Roman world. The manufactory near the gate was churning out barrels of the stuff, creating a stench that hung over the district like a fog. Lucius Caecilius Iucundus, a banker and auctioneer, walked these streets with a sense of ownership. He was a man of receipts, of wax tablets, of debts paid and owed. He moved through the crowd of tunic-clad slaves, merchants in togas, and farm girls carrying baskets of figs. He checked his accounts. A shipment of lamps from northern Italy. A mule sold at auction. A loan to a local baker. To Lucius, the trembling of the ground that had occurred earlier that morning was irrelevant. The earth shook all the time in Campania. It was just Campania shivering, as the locals said. It didn't stop the flow of gold, so it didn't matter. He walked past the Thermopolium, snack bar of Vasilina, where the smell of hot wine and sausages wafted out to the street. Men stood at the marble counter, joking, gambling with dice, ignoring the mountain looming at the end of the street like a stage backdrop. Part 3: The Blood and the Sand. While the merchants counted coins, the city's other heart, the amphitheater, was preparing for violence. Pompeii loved blood sports. Its amphitheater was the oldest stone arena in the Roman world, a massive concrete bowl capable of holding 20,000 screaming spectators, more than the entire population of the city, as people flooded in from the neighboring countryside for the games. In the gladiator barracks, a Thracian fighter named Celadus sat on a wooden bench, oiling his greaves. Graffiti found on the walls of the city described him as Suspirium Puellarum, the sigh of the girls. He was a celebrity, a rock star of the ancient world. But this morning, the air felt heavy in the barracks. The animals in the holding cages, bears imported from the mountains, boars trapped in the forests, were acting strangely. They were pacing, slamming themselves against the bars, whining with a primal anxiety. Animals can sense the infrasonic vibrations of shifting rock long before humans can. Celadus adjusted his helmet, feeling the sweat trickle down his back. It was unseasonably hot for October. The air felt thick, static, charged with an energy that made the hair on his arms stand up. He attributed it to the nerves of the coming fight. He didn't know that the ground beneath his sandals was vibrating at a frequency that spelled doom. Part 4: The View from Misenum. Across the Bay of Naples, 20 miles to the west, lay the naval base of Misenum. Here, the vibe was different. It was military, orderly, and precise. The commander of the fleet was Pliny the Elder. He was 56 years old, a man of immense intellect and curiosity. He was not just an admiral, he was the author of the Naturalis Historia, an encyclopedia of all known knowledge. He was the most learned man in the empire. That morning, Pliny was in his study working. He had taken a cold bath, eaten a light breakfast, and was reading. His sister noticed it first. She called him to the window. Uncle, his nephew, Pliny the Younger, would later write, pointed out a cloud of unusual size and appearance. It was around 1 p.m. Pliny the Elder stepped out onto the terrace. He squinted across the bay toward Vesuvius. A cloud was rising from the mountain. It did not look like smoke, it looked like a solid thing. It shot up into the sky, a vertical column of white, which then flattened out at the top. Pliny, searching for a description, said it looked like a Mediterranean pine tree. A tall trunk spreading out into branches. He was looking at a Plinian eruption column, a term that would later be named after him. It was a jet of superheated gas, ash, and pumice blasting into the stratosphere at supersonic speeds, reaching a height of 20 miles. It was powered by the thermal energy of 100,000 Hiroshima bombs. But from Misenum, it was silent. The distance hid the roar. To Pliny, it was a scientific anomaly. "My Liburnian galley," he ordered his slaves. "Prepare it. I want to see this closer." He thought he was going on a research trip. He picked up his stylus and tablets. He walked down to the harbor, completely unaware that he was looking at the end of the world. Part 5. The Darkness at Noon. Back in Pompeii, the illusion of normalcy shattered at 1 p.m. It didn't begin with lava. There were no rivers of molten rock. That is a Hollywood myth. It began with the sky turning to stone. A deafening crack, like the splitting of the sky, echoed off the limestone cliffs. The people in the forum froze. The haggling stopped. The dice stopped rolling. Everyone looked north. The top of Vesuvius had vanished. In its place was a pillar of gray fire rushing upward, punching a hole in the atmosphere. Then came the rain. But it wasn't water. It was lapilli, small porous stones of pumice, light as popcorn but hard as rock. They began to patter against the tiled roofs. Click, click, click. Then harder. Clack, clack, clack. Then a deluge. The sun was blotted out. The blue sky turned a bruised purple, then black. Darkness fell over the city at lunchtime. The air suddenly smelled of sulfur, the rotten egg smell of hell. In the house of the faun, the floor scrubbing stopped. The slaves looked at the master. The master looked at the ceiling, where the tiles were already beginning to rattle under the accumulation of falling stone. Panic is a slow contagion. At first, people just took cover. They stood under the eaves of shops, brushing the gray dust off their shoulders, waiting for the storm to pass. They didn't understand. Mountains didn't explode. This was weather. It had to be weather. But the stones kept falling. And the darkness kept growing. And the mountain kept roaring. Chapter 2, The Gray Rain. Pompeii and the Bay of Naples. October 24th, 79 AD. 1:30 p.m. to 5 p.m. Part 1, The Assault of the Stones. By early afternoon, the concept of weather had ceased to exist in Pompeii. The city was no longer sitting under a sky, it was sitting under a falling geologic formation. The eruption column, a supersonic jet of gas and magma, had pierced the stratosphere, reaching a height of 20 miles. There, in the freezing thin air, the molten rock shattered into billions of tiny fragments, solidified instantly, and fell back to Earth. This was the lapilli, a relentless hail of pumice stones. Individually, they were light, airy, and frothy, like hardened sponge. You could pick one up and float it in a bowl of water. But collectively, falling by the billions, they were a weapon of mass destruction. They struck the terracotta roof tiles with the force of musket balls, creating a deafening, continuous roar that drowned out screams, commands, and prayers. It sounded as if the city were trapped inside a drum being beaten by a giant. The streets of Pompeii, usually bustling with the noise of commerce, were transformed into gray, rushing rivers of stone. The pumice accumulated at a terrifying rate, 6 inches every hour. In the time it took to eat a meal, the stepping stones across the Via dell'Abbondanza disappeared. In the time it took to argue about what to do, the sidewalks vanished. The doors of the houses, which opened inward, began to jam against the rising tide of debris. Residents who ran inside to seek shelter found themselves in a terrifying paradox. The safer they felt inside, the more trapped they were becoming. The light was gone. At 2 p.m., it was pitch black, a darkness so absolute that torches and oil lamps were swallowed by the gloom. The air became hot and dry, sucking the moisture from throats and lungs, carrying the metallic taste of ash and the stinging scent of sulfur. Part 2, the trap of wealth. Inside the great villas, a psychological tragedy was unfolding. The Roman instinct for order and property became a fatal flaw. In the house of the Menander, the master of the house did not immediately flee. To flee was to abandon the accumulated wealth of generations, the silver plate, the bronze statues, the chests of gold coins locked in the tablinum. Instead, the wealthy wasted precious hours hiding their treasures. They buried jewelry in the garden. They locked silver services in the deepest cellars. They gathered their families in the atrium, hoping the storm would pass. Lucius Caecilius Iucundus, the banker, looked at his wax tablets, the records of every loan he had issued, the proof of his status. To leave them was to become a pauper. He hesitated. And while he hesitated, the pumice piled up against his front door. The slaves, who owned nothing, had the survival instinct of the destitute. They wanted to run. But Roman law was ironclad. A slave who abandoned his master could be crucified. So they stayed, crouching in the corners of the peristyle gardens, shielding their heads with pillows against the falling rocks, waiting for orders that came too late. The social hierarchy of Rome held firm even as the mountain tried to erase it. Part 3. The Message from the Shore. Across the bay at Misenum, the naval headquarters remained eerily clear. The wind was blowing southeast, driving the ash cloud directly over Pompeii and Stabi, leaving Misenum in the sunshine, watching the apocalypse from the dress circle. Pliny the Elder was preparing to board a light, fast boat for a scientific observation mission when a messenger arrived, breathless and terrified. He carried a wax tablet from a woman named Rectina, the wife of a friend who lived in a villa at the foot of the mountain near Herculaneum. Her message was a plea from the grave: the mountain is burning. The only escape is by sea. Save us. The scientific mission instantly transformed into a rescue operation. Pliny's demeanor shifted from that of a scholar to that of an admiral of the fleet. He ordered the immediate launch of the quadriremes, massive four-banked warships powered by hundreds of oarsmen. These were vessels designed to ram enemy ships and crush pirates, now repurposed to fight a volcano. As the massive ships were rowed out of the harbor, the steersman of Pliny's flagship looked at the wall of black cloud rising ahead of them, a towering lightning-streaked curtain of death, and hesitated. He advised the admiral to turn back. Pliny stood on the deck, the wind whipping his cloak, and delivered the line that would echo through history, a testament to Roman stoicism in the face of annihilation: Fortes fortuna juvat. Fortune favors the bold. He pointed the bow directly into the darkness. Steer to where others are fleeing, he ordered. Part 4. The Physics of Collapse. Back in Pompeii, by 4 p.m., the physics of the architecture began to fail. Roman roofs were engineering marvels designed to shed rain, not to hold tons of rock. The pumice was light, but as it piled up to depths of 3, 4, then 5 feet, the weight became unbearable. The thick timber beams of the roofs began to groan. In the darkness of the houses, people heard the wood splintering, a sharp cracking sound like a gunshot. Then came the collapses. One by one, the roofs of Pompeii gave way. Thousands of pounds of tiles, timber, and pumice crashed down into the living rooms and dining halls. Those who had sought shelter indoors were crushed instantly or trapped in pockets of air, buried alive in their own homes. The dust from the collapses choked the air, making it impossible to breathe. Survival now required a terrifying choice: stay inside and risk being crushed, or step outside into the pitch-black hail of rocks where the air was unbreathable and the streets were disappearing. Part 5. The River of Refugees. Those who chose to run faced a nightmare. They tied pillows to their heads with strips of linen to protect themselves from the falling stones. They carried lanterns that flickered feebly in the wind. They stumbled into the streets, sinking knee-deep into the rolling pumice, fighting for balance. It was a chaotic exodus. Families were separated in the dark. Children screamed for parents they couldn't see, though they were standing only feet away. The crowds pushed toward the city gates, the Herculaneum gate to the north, the Nuceria gate to the south. But the gates were bottlenecks. Carts jammed the archways. Horses, maddened by the stinging ash and the noise, kicked and trampled the refugees. Thieves, seizing the opportunity of the end of the world, snatched gold chains from the necks of women and cut purses from the belts of men, only to be trampled moments later, the stolen gold buried with them in the gray drifts. Outside the Nuceria gate, the fugitives found no relief. The countryside was a moonscape. The vineyards were gone, buried under the gray blanket. The road was indistinguishable from the fields. They trudged south, blind and choking, a procession of ghosts marching through a blizzard of stone. They didn't know where they were going. They only knew they had to put distance between themselves and the green mountain that had betrayed them. But the mountain was not done. It had only cleared its throat. The true horror, the heat, was yet to come. Chapter 3, The Boiling Night. Herculaneum, Stabii and Pompeii. October 24th to 25th, 79 AD. 8 p.m. to 2 a.m. Part 1, The Physics of Failure. As night fell over the Bay of Naples, the eruption entered a new, far more lethal phase. For 7 hours, Vesuvius had acted like a jet engine, pumping a continuous column of superheated ash and gas 20 miles into the stratosphere. This was a battle between thermal energy and gravity, and for the afternoon, thermal energy had won. But as the magma chamber emptied, the pressure began to fluctuate. The nozzle of the volcano widened, eroded by the friction of billions of tons of rock blasting through it. The velocity of the jet stream dropped. At approximately 1 a.m., the column could no longer support its own weight. Gravity finally claimed its due. High in the freezing upper atmosphere, the mushroom cloud began to collapse in on itself. It didn't drift away, it fell straight down, crashing back onto the slopes of the mountain. This created a pyroclastic surge, a ground-hugging avalanche of superheated gas, ash and rock. This was not a liquid lava flow that a man could outrun, it was a hurricane of fire moving at 100 miles an hour. It behaved like a fluid, but hit like a solid. It poured down the flanks of Vesuvius, glowing a demonic red in the darkness, silent at a distance but roaring like a freight train up close. It ignored the topography, vaulting over ridges and pouring into ravines. And it was heading directly for the seaside town of Herculaneum. Part 2, The Boat Sheds of Herculaneum. Herculaneum was a wealthier, smaller and more refined sister to Pompeii, located on the western flank of the volcano. Because of the wind direction, it had been spared the heavy ash fall that was burying Pompeii. The streets were relatively clear. The roofs were intact. But the people were terrified. Seeing the mountain burning above them, the entire population had fled to the waterfront. They gathered on the gray sand of the beach, looking out to sea, praying for rescue by the Roman navy. 300 men, women, and children huddled inside the stone arches of the fornaci, the vaulted boat sheds lined up along the marina. They brought their jewelry, their lamps and their warmest cloaks, believing they were safe inside the thick concrete walls. They were waiting for the boats. Instead, they got the surge. The first surge hit Herculaneum at 1 a.m. It did not knock on the door, it vaporized the city. The cloud, with a temperature of 500 degrees Celsius, 900 degrees Fahrenheit, slammed into the waterfront. It was instant thermal shock. For the people huddled in the boat sheds, there was no time to suffocate, no time to burn, and perhaps no time to even feel pain. The heat was so intense that it boiled the brain tissue inside their skulls instantly, causing the bones to explode from the internal steam pressure. Their muscles contracted in a pugilistic attitude, curling their bodies into the fetal position in a fraction of a second. It was not a death, it was an erasure. The surge filled the boat sheds with ash, sealing the 300 bodies in a concrete tomb that would not be opened for nearly 2,000 years. The city of Herculaneum simply ceased to exist, buried under 60 feet of boiling mud that would harden into solid rock, preserving the town perfectly in its final moment of agony. Part 3, The Admiral's Last Stand. 10 miles south, at the coastal resort of Stabii, Pliny the Elder was fighting a different battle. He had landed his warships to rescue his friend Pompeii, but the same onshore wind that had brought the ash had trapped them there. The seas were too rough to launch the ships back into the bay. They were stranded. Pliny, ever the stoic Roman aristocrat, refused to show fear. To calm the panic of his friends, he famously took a bath, sat down to dinner, and then went to sleep, his loud snoring echoing through the villa while the walls shook from the tremors. It was a performance of absolute courage, designed to project stability in the midst of chaos. But outside the villa, the courtyard was filling with pumice. By 2 a.m., the level of debris had risen so high that the servants realized if they didn't wake Pliny now, he would be entombed in his bedroom. They roused the old admiral. He stumbled out, groggy and asthmatic, leaning on 2 slaves. The group decided to flee to the open fields, tying pillows to their heads with linen strips to protect against the falling rocks. The scene was surreal. The darkness was total, blacker and denser than any ordinary night, broken only by the flashes of sheet lightning generated by the static electricity in the ash cloud. They walked through a landscape of nightmares, the torches flickering feebly against a wind that smelled of sulfur and death. Pliny gasped for air, his throat closing up from the toxic fumes and the dense dust. He sat down on a sail that had been spread out for him, asking for cold water. He drank twice, then tried to stand, but collapsed. The greatest naturalist in the world died there on the beach, suffocated by the very phenomenon he had come to study, his body left behind as his friends scattered into the dark. Part 4. The Darkness of the Mind. Back in Pompeii, the terror was psychological. The ash fall had slowed slightly, but the darkness was absolute. The city was buried up to the first floor of the buildings. Those who had stayed inside were now trapped. To open a door was impossible. The weight of the pumice outside jammed it shut. People had to climb out of upper-story windows onto the new ground level of ash, wandering across the roofs of their own city. The air was thick and hot, clogging the nose and burning the eyes. Inside the houses that hadn't collapsed, the sensory deprivation drove people to the brink of madness. Pliny the Younger, writing years later, described the sounds that pierced the darkness. You could hear the shrieks of women, the wailing of infants, and the shouting of men. Some were calling their parents, others their children or their wives, trying to recognize them by their voices. The Roman world was deeply superstitious. They did not see a geological event, they saw the anger of the gods. Many believed the myths of the Gigantomachy, that the giants buried beneath the earth were breaking free to destroy the heavens. Others believed that the sun had died forever and that the world was returning to the primordial chaos. There were no atheists in Pompeii that night. There were only people praying to gods who had stopped listening. Part 5. The Suspended Breath. As the night wore on towards dawn, a strange lull settled over Pompeii. The violent crashing of the stones subsided into a steady sandy rain. Some survivors, exhausted and dehydrated, allowed themselves a flicker of hope. Maybe the worst was over. Maybe the mountain had emptied itself. They lit their lamps and checked their water jars, filtering the dust through cloth. They whispered plans to dig out their valuables at first light. They didn't know that the eruption column was pulsing, preparing for its final, most catastrophic collapse. The surge that had destroyed Herculaneum had stopped short of Pompeii, blocked by the northern wall. But the next surge would be higher, hotter, and faster. The city lay in the dark, a wounded animal waiting for the predator to return, unaware that the sunrise would not bring light, but a wall of fire. Chapter 4. The Morning of Ghosts. Pompeii. October 25th, 79 AD. 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. Part 1. The False Dawn. By the clocks of the empire, it should have been morning. Under normal circumstances, the sun would be cresting the Apennine Mountains, casting its golden light over the vineyards and the sea. But on October 25th, there was no sun. There was only a suffocating, impenetrable blackness that was heavier and more absolute than any night the inhabitants had ever known. The air was thick with static electricity, causing the hair on arms to stand up and clothing to cling to bodies. Lightning, volcanic thunderbolts generated by the friction of ash particles colliding in the atmosphere, jagged across the sky in terrifying webs of green and violet, illuminating the ruined city in strobe light flashes. In these brief, ghostly bursts of light, the survivors saw a landscape from a nightmare. The streets were gone, filled level with the windowsills by gray pumice. The roofs were shattered skeletons. The familiar landmarks, the temples, the statues, the fountains, were buried or broken. Pompeii had been reduced to a monochromatic wasteland of gray, smelling of sulfur and wet cement. Inside the remaining structures, the air quality had degraded to a toxic soup. The fumaroles, small vents in the ash layer, were off-gassing carbon dioxide and hydrogen chloride. Those who had survived the night in their basements or back rooms were now waking up with pounding headaches, nausea, and a feeling of heavy drowsiness. This was the silent killer, asphyxiation. The gas was heavier than air, pooling in the low-lying areas, extinguishing lamps and lives with equal indifference. In the house of the tragic poet, a dog remained chained to a post in the atrium. As the pumice rose, the animal had climbed higher and higher, straining against its bronze collar, fighting for air until the ash finally covered it. Its struggle was a microcosm of the city, a desperate, clawing fight against an enemy that could not be fought, only endured. Part 2. The Fourth Surge. At roughly 6:30 a.m., the volcano delivered the death blow. The eruption column, which had been pulsing weekly for hours, suffered a total catastrophic collapse. A massive section of the cloud, billions of tons of superheated material, plummeted straight down onto the cone and rebounded outward. This was Surge 4. Unlike the earlier flows that had destroyed Herculaneum, this one had enough momentum to crest the northern walls of Pompeii. It did not move like a liquid, it moved like a living wall of turbulent gas, glowing a dull red at its core, rolling over the landscape at 60 miles per hour. It hit the Herculaneum gate first, ripping the heavy bronze doors from their hinges and tossing multi-ton tombstones like pebbles. The surge that entered the city was a pyroclastic density current. It was a mixture of gas and fine ash heated to approximately 300 degrees Celsius, 570 degrees Fahrenheit. It was not hot enough to vaporize bodies instantly as it had in Herculaneum, but it was hot enough to kill in a single breath. As the cloud rolled through the streets, it ignored the street grid, pouring over walls and through windows. It was a silent assassin. The roar of the mountain was distant, but the surge itself made a hissing sound, like 1,000 snakes, as it devoured the oxygen in its path. The thermal shock hit the inhabitants before the ash did. It was a wave of heat so intense that it caused immediate cadaveric spasm, the muscles contracting instantly, freezing the victims in the exact position of their death. There was no time to run. There was only time to gasp. Part 3. The Garden of the Fugitives. In the southern part of the city, near the Nuceria Gate, a group of 13 people had been trying to flee through a vineyard. They were a mix of ages and classes, a merchant family perhaps, and their slaves. They carried lanterns and sacks of coins, stumbling through the deep pumice drifts of the previous day, their legs heavy with exhaustion. They saw the wall of darkness coming from the north, a towering tsunami of gray rolling over the rooftops. They realized, with a terrifying clarity, that they could not outrun it. They did not scream. The air was too hot to inhale. Instead, they sat down. The heat hit them a second later. It curled their bodies into the fetal position, the boxer's pose, as their tendons contracted. A mother threw herself over her small child, trying to shield him with her own body, pressing his face into her tunic. A man raised his hands to his face as if to ward off a blow. They died instantly, their brains flashing into unconsciousness before the pain could fully register. Then came the ash. The fine, flour-like dust of the surge settled over their bodies, coating them layer by layer. It packed around them, hardening like cement, creating a perfect mold of their final moments. It captured the folds of their clothes, the expressions on their faces, and the desperate geometry of their limbs. They were not buried, they were encased. They became statues of their own death, waiting in the darkness of the vineyard for 2,000 years. Part 4. The Villa of Diomedes. Outside the city walls, in the opulent villa of Diomedes, a different tragedy played out. The master of the house, believing that the thick walls of his cellar would protect his family, had herded 18 people, women, children, and servants, into the subterranean cryptoporticus. They brought food and water, prepared to wait out the storm. But the villa was a trap. When the surge hit, the fine, hot ash poured through the narrow ventilation windows of the cellar. It didn't fill the room with dirt, it filled it with unbreathable gas and heat. The panic in the dark cellar was absolute. The victims crowded into the corner furthest from the windows, climbing over one another in a desperate attempt to find fresh air. They covered their mouths with their tunics, but the dust was so fine it passed through the cloth, mixing with the moisture in their lungs to form a concrete paste. They suffocated in the dark, surrounded by their wealth. The master of the house was found later near the garden gate, clutching a silver key and a bag of gold coins, having made a last-ditch attempt to escape, leaving his family behind in the dark. The gold lay scattered in the ash next to his skeleton, as useless as the stones that had killed him. Part 5. The Final Silence. By 8 a.m., the surges had finished their work. A final, massive flow covered the entire city, burying the tallest buildings completely. The landscape was unrecognizable. Where there had once been a bustling Roman city of bright colors, shouting merchants, and barking dogs, there was now a smooth gray desert. The coastline had been pushed out by half a mile, choked with debris. The Sarno River was clogged with mud. Vesuvius itself had changed shape. The tall, conical peak was gone, replaced by a gaping, jagged caldera that smoked menacingly. The silence that settled over the Bay of Naples was heavy and profound. There were no birds singing. There was no wind in the trees, for there were no trees left. The only sound was the hissing of the cooling ash and the occasional settlement of the debris. Pompeii had been erased from the map. It was not just destroyed, it was deleted. The survivors who had escaped the day before looked back from the safety of Naples or Sorrento and saw nothing. The city of their childhoods, the city of their loves and rivalries, was simply gone, buried under 20 feet of volcanic rock. The Roman Empire, usually so efficient at recording history, would eventually forget where Pompeii had been. Grass would grow over the ash. New vineyards would be planted on the graves of the city. Pompeii would sleep in the dark, a suspended moment in time, waiting for the spades of the future to wake it from its gray slumber. Chapter 5: The Looters and the Lost. Campania. November, 79 AD, 2nd century AD. Part 1: The Gray Desert. In the weeks following the eruption, the sun finally returned to the Bay of Naples, but it illuminated a world that was alien and unrecognizable. The lush, verdant paradise of Campania, once the playground of the Roman elite, had been transformed into a monochromatic moonscape. The ash had hardened into a crust that stretched for miles, smoothing over the hills and valleys like a heavy gray blanket. The coastline had advanced nearly a mile into the sea, choked with pumice rafts and debris. The Sarno River, once a bustling commercial artery, was now a sluggish, mud-choked stream that had been forced into a new course. For the survivors huddled in the refugee camps of Neapolis and Sorrento, the most terrifying aspect was not the destruction, but the erasure. They would climb the ridges to look for their homes, scanning the horizon for the familiar bell towers or temple columns, but there was nothing. The city of Pompeii was not ruined, it was gone. It lay buried beneath 20 feet of volcanic material, a new topography where the roofs of the tallest buildings were mere bumps in the gray desert. The silence was absolute, broken only by the wind hissing over the ash dunes, a stark contrast to the noisy, vibrant life that had existed only days before. Part 2: The Emperor's Tears. The news of the catastrophe reached Rome quickly, carried by breathless messengers on fresh horses. The new emperor, Titus, who had only been on the throne for a few months, was devastated. He was a man striving to be a benevolent ruler, the delight of mankind, but his reign seemed cursed by the gods. He immediately dispatched a commission of senators, the curators restitutionis Campanii, to the region with funds from the imperial treasury. Titus himself visited the disaster zone, walking the perimeter of the ash fields. Historical accounts suggest the emperor was deeply moved, but as he stood on the edge of the gray wasteland, looking at the spot where thriving cities had once stood, he faced a grim pragmatic reality. The destruction was too total. There was no rubble to clear, no fires to put out. The cities were hermetically sealed. The commission made the difficult decision: Pompeii and Herculaneum would not be rebuilt. They were declared locus maledictus, cursed places. The funds were redirected to resettling the thousands of refugees in Neapolis and Nola, and the land was abandoned to the ghosts. Part 3: The Tunnels of Greed. However, while the state walked away, individual greed persisted. In the months and years immediately following the eruption, the site of Pompeii became the target of the first great salvage operation, or more accurately, a massive looting spree. The tops of the tallest buildings, such as the Forum Colonnade and the upper stories of the great villas, still poked out of the ash like tombstones. Using these as markers, teams of diggers returned to the site. They were not archaeologists, they were tunnelers. They dug narrow, dangerous shafts, cuniculi, straight down through the hardened ash, breaking through the roofs of the buried houses. These men worked by the light of flickering oil lamps in unstable, suffocating tunnels, breathing air that still smelled faintly of sulfur. The archaeological record tells the story of their theft. We find houses where the walls have been smashed through from room to room. These looters were not interested in the history, they were interested in the materials. They stripped the marble veneers from the walls. They ripped the lead pipes out of the fountains to melt down. They hauled up bronze statues, often hacking them off their pedestals. In the Forum, the massive statues of the emperor and his family were missing, likely salvaged by the Roman government itself. But in the private houses, it was a free-for-all. The looters were ruthless unsentimentalists. They would tunnel into a room, find a family of skeletons huddled in the corner, and step over the bones to pry a gold bracelet from a skeletal wrist or steal a silver mirror. They left behind their own traces, graffiti scratched into the walls of the tunnels, broken picks, and lamps dropped in the dark. For decades, Pompeii was a subterranean mine, picked clean of its most obvious treasures by men who crawled through the graves of their neighbors. Part 4. The changing of the map. As the years turned into decades, the memory of what lay beneath began to fade. The loose ash settled and compacted. Nature, resilient and indifferent to human tragedy, began to reclaim the land. Weeds took root in the volcanic soil, which was rich in minerals. Then came the shrubs, and finally the trees. The gray desert slowly turned green again. Farmers returned to the area, attracted by the fertile earth. They planted new vineyards and olive groves on the surface, completely unaware that 20 feet beneath their plowshares lay the intact streets of a Roman city. They built farmhouses using stones they found sticking out of the ground, the tops of Pompeii's temples, unaware of their origin. The map had changed permanently. The Sarno River no longer flowed by the city walls. The sea was far away. The geography that had defined Pompeii as a port city was obliterated, erasing the very reason for its existence. Part 5. The Name of the Dead. By the 2nd century AD, the name Pompeii began to vanish from the spoken language. It appeared on old maps, but locals no longer knew exactly where it was. The area became known simply as La Civita, the city, a vague folk memory that something had once been there, but the specifics were lost to myth. The Roman Empire fell, the Dark Ages descended, and the knowledge of the ancient world retreated into monasteries.
Pompeii slept.
It slept through the fall of Rome, the rise of Byzantium, the Middle Ages, and the Renaissance. For 1500 years, the city lay in a state of suspended animation, a time capsule hermetically sealed by the ash. The bodies of the fugitives, encased in their hardened shells, waited in the darkness. The bread sat in the ovens, carbonized but intact. The dogs remained chained to their posts. The world moved on, fighting wars and building cathedrals, completely forgetting the vibrant, noisy city that lay just beneath the grass, waiting for a shovel to strike a stone and wake the dead. Chapter 6. The Resurrection.
Naples.
1592 to 1863. Part 1. The Architect's Secret. For nearly 1500 years, the city of Pompeii lay beneath a shroud of earth and myth, known only by the vague peasant name La Civita. The vineyards grew thick and sweet on the volcanic soil, their roots twisting through the roofs of buried Roman villas, drinking the nutrients of the past. The first crack in this silence appeared in 1592, not through science, but through the mundane necessity of water. The famous architect Domenico Fontana was commissioned to dig a canal to divert the Sarno River to feed the mills of a local count. As his workmen hacked through the hardened earth, their pickaxes struck dressed stone. They uncovered walls covered in strange, vibrant paintings, frescoes of red and ochre depicting exotic birds, gods, and sexually explicit scenes. Fontana was a man of the Counter-Reformation, a time of strict religious morality. Confronted with ancient Roman erotica emerging from the mud, he made a decision that would seal the city's fate for another century and a half. He ordered the walls reburied. He did not realize he had found Pompeii. He thought he had stumbled upon a private villa of a degenerate Roman. The canal was finished, the earth was smoothed over, and the city went back to sleep, guarding its secrets a little longer.
Part 2. The King's Treasure Hunt.
The true awakening began in 1738, not at Pompeii, but at Herculaneum. Workmen digging a well for an Austrian prince struck the stage of the ancient theater, pulling up stunning marble statues. This discovery ignited the greed of the new king of Naples, Charles III of Bourbon. Charles was not a scholar. He was a monarch who needed to legitimize his rule with prestige. He viewed the buried cities not as historical sites, but as underground quarries of art to decorate his palaces. He appointed a Spanish military engineer, Roque Joaquin de Alcubierre, to lead the excavation. Alcubierre was a man of gunpowder and tunnels, completely lacking in archaeological delicacy. In 1748, Alcubierre turned his attention to La Civita. On April 1st, his men struck the first wall of Pompeii. The excavation was brutal. They dug haphazard pits and tunnels, smashing through walls and destroying frescoes to get to the good stuff: the bronze statues, the gold jewelry, and the silver cups. If a wall painting was deemed not beautiful enough for the King's Museum, it was left to rot in the open air or destroyed. The reports from this era are heartbreaking to modern historians. Found a room with paintings. Nothing of value.
Destroyed.
Pompeii was being discovered, but it was also being murdered a second time. It was treated as a mine, its treasures ripped from their context and hauled off to the royal palace in Pompeii to serve as conversation pieces for the court.
Part 3. The Shift to Sunlight.
The turning point came with the arrival of Johann Joachim Winckelmann in the 1760s. A German art historian, Winckelmann was horrified by the Bourbon looting. He wrote blistering letters criticizing Alcubierre's methods, famously declaring that the engineer knew as much about antiquities as a shrimp knows about the moon. Winckelmann argued that the context mattered, that a statue was meaningless without the house it stood in, that the daily life of the Romans was the real treasure. His influence slowly shifted the approach. In the early 19th century, under the French occupation of Naples, commanded by Napoleon's sister, Caroline Murat, the tunneling stopped. They began to clear the earth layer by layer, exposing the city to the sun for the first time in millennia. The sheer scale of Pompeii became apparent. It wasn't just a few villas, it was a sprawling urban complex. Streets emerged, lined with snack bars, bakeries with carbonized loaves still in the ovens, and brothels with stone beds. Visitors on the Grand Tour, poets like Shelley and Goethe, flocked to the site. They walked the Via dell'Abbondanza, marveling at the ruts in the road and the graffiti on the walls. But the city was still empty. The people were missing. The skeletons found by the early diggers were often disregarded, the bones piled into heaps and ignored. The humanity of Pompeii was still a ghost, sensed but not seen.
Part 4. The Hollow Men.
In 1863, a new director of excavations took charge, Giuseppe Fiorelli. He was a revolutionary, a man who brought scientific rigor to the chaos. He stopped the treasure hunting and began digging from the top down, preserving the buildings. But his greatest contribution was solving the mystery of the voids. For years, workmen had reported hitting strange hollow pockets in the hardened ash. When they broke into them, they found nothing but dust and a few bones. The ash had hardened around the bodies of the victims in 79 AD, forming a perfect mold. Over the centuries, the soft tissue of the bodies had decomposed, leaving a human-shaped vacuum inside the rock. Fiorelli had a stroke of genius. He ordered his men that whenever they found a void, they were not to break it open. Instead, they were to mix a slurry of plaster of Paris and pour it down the hole until it was full. They would wait for the plaster to harden, then carefully chip away the surrounding ash.
Part 5. The Scream of Stone.
The first time they chipped away the ash from a plaster casting, the workmen dropped their tools in horror. What emerged was not a statue or a skeleton.
It was a man.
The plaster had captured every detail of the victim at the moment of death. It showed the folds of his tunic, the leather straps of his sandals, the expression of agony on his face. It showed his teeth clenched in pain, his hands clawing at the earth. Fiorelli had not just found bodies, he had resurrected the dead. He found a dog, twisted in its chain, its mouth open in a silent howl. He found a man sitting against a wall, his hands covering his face in resignation. He found a pregnant woman lying face down, clutching her belly. These casts changed the world's understanding of history. Suddenly, the Romans were not distant, marble figures in togas standing on pedestals. They were real people, terrified, suffering, and dying in the dark.
They were us.
The plaster casts brought a shocking, emotional violence to the site. Visitors could no longer look at Pompeii as a romantic ruin. They were forced to look into the faces of the victims. The Garden of the Fugitives, where 13 casts were eventually displayed, became a sacred space, a place where the barrier between the living and the dead was dissolved by the chemistry of plaster and ash.
Part 6. The Time Machine.
By the late 19th century, Pompeii had become the most famous archaeological site on Earth. It offered something no other ruin could: total immersion.
In Rome, the Colosseum was a shell.
In Athens, the Parthenon was stripped. But in Pompeii, you could walk into a bar and see the stains of wine cups on the marble counter. You could walk into a bakery and see the millstones ready to grind grain. You could read the political slogans on the walls and the dirty jokes scratched into the bathroom stalls.
It was a time machine.
The disaster that had destroyed the city had also saved it, sealing it in an oxygen-free envelope that preserved the mundane details of daily life that history usually forgets. Pompeii became the ultimate paradox. The deadest city in the world was also the most alive. But as the 20th century dawned, a new threat emerged. The city that had survived the volcano was about to face the slow, grinding destruction of exposure to the modern world. Chapter 7: The Second Death.
Pompeii.
1943, present.
Part 1. The Bombs of August.
In the long, violent history of Pompeii, the year 1943 marked a cruel and ironic turning point. The city that had been destroyed by the indifferent wrath of nature was subjected to the calculated wrath of man. During the Italian campaign of World War II, Allied forces suspected that German divisions were hiding among the ruins, using the ancient walls as camouflage for anti-aircraft guns and ammunition depots. On August 24th and September 13th, almost exactly on the anniversary of the eruption, American and British bombers flew over the Bay of Naples. They did not spare the archaeological site. Over 160 bombs plummeted onto the excavated city. The destruction was heartbreaking. The antiquarium, the museum housing thousands of artifacts, was hit directly, shattering centuries of preservation in a millisecond. The House of the Faun, the jewel of Pompeii, saw 2 bombs tear through its atrium, destroying the intricate architectural balance that had survived the volcano. The devastation proved a grim thesis. Vesuvius had buried the city to save it, but by digging it up, humanity had exposed it to the savagery of modern warfare. The ruins, having survived the fire of the earth, were nearly erased by the fire from the sky.
Part 2. The Trembling Earth.
Peace returned to Europe, but the ground beneath Campania remained restless. In November 1980, the Irpinia earthquake struck southern Italy with a magnitude of 6.9. While it devastated modern villages, killing nearly 3,000 people, it also wreaked havoc on the fragile skeleton of Pompeii. Walls that had stood since the time of Nero cracked and crumbled. Columns that had been painstakingly re-erected by archaeologists in the 19th century toppled like dominoes. The earthquake exposed the structural fragility of the site, but it also exposed a human rot, negligence. In the chaotic aftermath of the quake, security at the site collapsed. Organized crime syndicates and opportunistic looters raided the unguarded warehouses. Frescoes were chiseled off walls in the dead of night, marble heads were snapped off statues. This was the second death of Pompeii, a slow, agonizing demise caused not by lava, but by theft, lack of funding, and the relentless creep of weeds and water infiltration. By the turn of the millennium, Pompeii was listed as a collapsing ruin, a symbol of Italian cultural mismanagement rather than a triumph of history.
Part 3. The Collapse of Glory.
The breaking point arrived at dawn on November 6, 2010. The Scola Armaturarum, the House of the Gladiators, was a sturdy structure on the Via dell'Abbondanza where the fighters of ancient Pompeii once trained. It had survived the eruption and the bombings, but it could not survive the rain. After days of torrential downpours, water infiltrated the unsealed roofs and pooled behind the ancient walls. Under the immense hydraulic pressure, the building simply gave up. With a dull roar, the entire structure collapsed into a pile of rubble and wet dust. There were no casualties, but the shockwave was global. The image of the collapsed house was splashed across newspapers from New York to Tokyo.
It was a wake-up call.
The European Union and the Italian government realized that if they did not act, Pompeii would dissolve into mud within a generation. This disaster birthed the Great Pompeii Project, a massive infusion of €105 million dedicated not to digging up new treasures, but to shoring up the walls, diverting the water, and saving what was left.
Part 4. The Invasion of the Living.
While the engineers fought the water, the conservators fought a more insidious enemy, the tourists. In the 21st century, Pompeii became a victim of its own fame, attracting nearly 4 million visitors a year. This human tide acts as a slow-motion abrasive machine. Millions of feet wear down the Roman paving stones that had survived chariots. Backpacks scrape against fragile frescoes, eroding the pigments. The carbon dioxide exhaled by millions of lungs changes the microclimate inside the small villas, accelerating the chemical decay of the plaster. The site struggles to balance the need for revenue with the need for preservation. It is a Disneylandization of death, where cruise ship passengers rush through the streets in 40-minute tours to take selfies with the plaster casts of the dead, often treating the victims as props rather than people. The silence of the ruins is now drowned out by the cacophony of megaphones and tour guides, turning the sacred city of echoes into a crowded theme park where the solemnity of the tragedy is often lost in the noise.
Part 5. The Glass Bones.
However, the 21st century also brought a scientific renaissance. Modern archaeology moved beyond the shovel and the pickaxe to the CT scanner and the DNA sequencer. In 2015, a team of researchers began scanning the famous plaster casts created by Fiorelli. They did not break them open, they looked through them with X-rays. The results were startling. The scans revealed that the people of Pompeii had nearly perfect teeth, a testament to a diet low in sugar and high in fiber and fluoride from the volcanic water. They found that the victims were not just the old and infirm, but a complete cross-section of society. The most shocking revelations came from DNA analysis, which dismantled centuries of Victorian myths. For decades, a famous cast of two figures embracing was known as the Two Maidens, assumed to be women dying in each other's arms. DNA testing revealed they were actually two unrelated men, perhaps lovers, perhaps strangers clinging to each other in the final terror. Another famous cast, the Mulberry Man, a beggar found in a humble tunic, was revealed to be a robust, healthy 20-year-old, not an old pauper. Science stripped away the romantic stories invented by 19th-century tour guides and replaced them with complex, biological truths. The casts were no longer just statues. The scans showed the actual human bones suspended inside the plaster shells, the fragile remnants of the people who had woken up on that October morning expecting a normal day. Part 6. The Date on the Wall. Perhaps the most significant discovery of the modern era was the smallest. For centuries, historians believed the eruption occurred on August 24th, based on a medieval manuscript of Pliny's letters. But archaeologists had always been puzzled by the presence of autumn fruits, pomegranates and walnuts, found in the ruins, and the heavy wool clothing worn by the victims. In 2018, excavations in the undug Region V uncovered a house that was being renovated at the time of the disaster. On a white wall, a worker had scrawled a charcoal graffito joking about his lunch. The charcoal was fragile, it should have faded in a week. But the eruption sealed it. The date on the wall was 16K NOV, the 16th day before the calends of November. This translates to October 17th. This tiny scribble rewrote the history books. The eruption likely happened a week later, on October 24th. The people of Pompeii did not die in the summer heat, they died in the autumn chill. It was a humbling reminder that even after 300 years of excavation, Pompeii still holds secrets that can overturn everything we think we know. The city is not a finished book, it is a puzzle that is still being assembled piece by piece, by a generation of scientists who treat the site with a forensic reverence their ancestors lacked. Chapter 8: The Eternal Warning. Naples and the Red Zone.
Present day, the future. Part 1. The Sleeping Monster.
To stand on the rim of the Great Cono, the crater of Vesuvius, today is a deceptively peaceful experience. The climb is a tourist ritual. Visitors hike up the steep paths of loose, reddish gravel, smelling the sulfur that still vents lazily from the fumaroles, to look down into the throat of the beast. The crater is a deep, jagged bowl of gray rock, silent save for the wind whistling off the Bay of Naples.
It looks dead.
It looks like a relic of history, a museum piece that did its terrible work 2,000 years ago and then retired. But this silence is a lie. Vesuvius is not dead, it is merely recharging. It is an active stratovolcano, one of the most dangerous on Earth, sitting on top of a tear in the African tectonic plate. The magma chamber deep beneath the rock is slowly, inexorably refilling. The plug that sealed the vent after the last major eruption in 1944 is thickening, building up the pressure required for the next explosion. The mountain is a loaded gun pointed at the head of Europe, and the fuse is burning just out of sight.
Part 2. The City in the Crosshairs.
Getty Images. The true horror of Vesuvius today is not the mountain itself, but what lies at its feet. In 79 AD, the region was populated by wealthy villas and small towns totaling perhaps 50,000 people. Today, the slopes of the volcano and the surrounding plain are covered by a dense, chaotic sprawl of concrete. This is the Red Zone, Zona Rossa. It includes 25 municipalities and is home to nearly 700,000 people. If you expand the radius to include the metropolitan area of Naples, nearly 3 million people live within the strike zone of a major eruption. They have built their apartment blocks, schools, and hospitals directly on top of the solidified lava flows of the past. It is the most densely populated volcanic region in the world. The illegal construction is rampant. Houses creep higher and higher up the flanks of the mountain, defying zoning laws and common sense, driven by the fertile soil and the fatalistic Neapolitan spirit that shrugs at danger. Part 3. The Nightmare Logistics. The Italian government has a plan, the National Emergency Plan for Vesuvius. It is a document of terrifying logistics. It calls for the evacuation of the entire red zone within 72 hours of an eruption warning. It envisions 700,000 people moving in an orderly fashion on designated trains and buses to safe regions across Italy. But critics call this a fantasy. Naples is a city defined by gridlock on a normal Tuesday. In the panic of an impending apocalypse, with ash falling and the earth shaking, the narrow streets would likely become parking lots of doom. The 72-hour window assumes the volcano will give a clear warning. But volcanoes are capricious. A subplinian or Plinian eruption could begin with little notice, turning the evacuation routes into death traps. The plan relies on a level of social order that rarely exists in a catastrophe. The reality is that if Vesuvius wakes up with the fury of 79 AD, it will likely be the greatest humanitarian disaster in modern European history. Part 4. The Paradox of Memory. Why do millions of people choose to live inside the barrel of a cannon? It is the same paradox that killed the residents of Pompeii.
The soil is rich.
The view is beautiful. The danger feels abstract and distant. Humans are neurologically wired to prioritize immediate threats, unemployment, crime, rent, over low probability, high consequence geological events. We look at the mountain and see a landscape, not a threat. The ruins of Pompeii, which should serve as a screaming warning sign, have instead become a sanitized tourist attraction. We walk the streets of the dead, buy a magnet, and then drive back to our hotels in the red zone, failing to connect the dots. We believe that technology, satellites, and sensors will save us. We believe we are smarter than the Romans. But the Romans had engineers and philosophers too. They felt just as modern and safe as we do, right up until the moment the sky turned black.
Part 5. The Final Mirror.
Ultimately, Pompeii is not a story about the past. It is a story about the future. It is a mirror held up to our own civilization. We look at the plaster casts of the victims, the mother clutching her child, the man covering his face, and we weep for them because we recognize ourselves. They are not ancient history. They are us, stripped of our pretensions, facing the fragility of existence. Pompeii teaches us that everything we build is temporary. Our cities, our bank accounts, our political squabbles, all of it can be erased in a single afternoon by the indifference of the planet.
The city waits.
The bodies in the garden of the fugitives wait.
And the mountain waits.
Vesuvius will erupt again. It is a geological certainty. It might be next year, or it might be in 500 years. But when it does, the ash will fall on new roofs, new streets, and new people. And perhaps, 2,000 years from now, future archaeologists will dig down through the layers of the 21st century, uncover our cars and our smartphones encased in rock, and wonder why we didn't run when we had the chance. The story of Pompeii has no end. It is a cycle of destruction and rebirth, an eternal warning carved in stone that nature always bats last.
The end.
The history of the Shadow of Vesuvius.